I learned something the day two uniformed HOA guards told me I needed permission to step onto my own family farm. The most dangerous lies are the ones wearing official badges and carrying clipboards. The tires of my dusty Ford F-250 crunched over familiar gravel until they stopped in front of a brand-new black iron gate that had never existed when my father was alive. The late afternoon sun reflected off polished steel letters that read Oak Ridge Farm Estates, a name that felt so foreign on that land, it was like hearing someone call your own mother by the wrong name. The smell of fresh-cut cedar mixed with newly poured asphalt drifted through the open window, drowning out the scent of hay and rich Texas soil I had known since I was old enough to walk. Before I could even shut off the engine, two security guards stepped into the driveway wearing matching gray uniforms with bright HOA patches stitched onto their sleeves. One of them lifted a hand, calm but firm, signaling me to stop as if I were some lost delivery driver. I rolled down the window and smiled politely. "Afternoon," I said. "I'm here to check on my dad's farm." The older guard barely looked at me before glancing down at a tablet in his hands. His expression never changed. "Name?" he asked. "Ethan Walker." He typed for a few seconds while the only sounds around us were the distant hum of cicadas and the faint clinking of a windmill turning somewhere beyond the trees. Then he looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. "Sir, according to our records, you're permanently banned from entering this property." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. I even laughed once, waiting for the punchline that never came. "I'm sorry," I said, pointing beyond the gate toward the faded red barn that my grandfather built with his own hands in 1958. "My family has owned this farm for 3 generations. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. The older one remained perfectly professional. "If you refuse to leave, we'll contact the county sheriff for trespassing." Trespassing. The word hit harder than I expected. I stared past them at the weathered oak tree where my father taught me to cast a fishing line, at the porch where my mother drank coffee every sunrise, at the fence posts I had painted as a teenager during summer break. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow none of it belonged to me anymore. A luxury SUV rolled slowly past inside the property, its driver barely glancing in my direction before disappearing toward a cluster of newly built model homes that hadn't existed the last time I visited. Fresh landscaping covered the old cattle trail. Decorative stone signs replaced wooden markers. Someone had tried to erase 70 years of family history with expensive concrete and perfect grass. I reached into the glove box and wrapped my fingers around the old brass key my father carried every day until he passed away 8 months earlier. The metal felt cool and worn from decades of honest work. It no longer fit the gate standing in front of me, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Because deep down I already knew something those guards didn't. Gates can be replaced. Signs can be changed. Locks can be swapped. But the truth buried beneath family land has a way of waiting patiently for the right person to come home. I sat there for another minute with the truck idling, listening to the steady rumble of the engine and the soft ticking sound coming from the dashboard as it cooled in the afternoon heat. The guards had already walked back toward their small security booth, convinced their job was finished. They had no idea that every inch of that property carried a memory stronger than any document sitting inside their office. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 35 years old, and I grew up believing that land was never just dirt. My grandfather, Samuel Walker, bought those 143 acres in East Texas after returning home from the Korean War with little more than a pickup truck, a toolbox, and enough determination to build something his children would never have to borrow from anyone else. He cleared the first fields himself. He dug fence post holes by hand. He planted pecan trees that still line the southern pasture today. My father, Robert Walker, inherited that same stubborn work ethic. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, he would wake me with the smell of bacon drifting through the old farmhouse and tell me that the cows never cared whether we felt tired. By 6 o'clock, we would already be riding across the property, the cool morning air carrying the scent of fresh grass while birds scattered across the open fields ahead of us. Those memories were never about making money. They were about earning the right to call that place home. My father never trusted shortcuts. If a fence leaned, we fixed it. If a tractor broke, we rebuilt it instead of replacing it. He used to run his weathered hand across the wooden barn wall and smile before saying, "Everything standing here tells a story. If you stop taking care of it, Somebody else will write the ending for you. At the time, I thought he was only talking about buildings. I did not understand he was talking about people. 8 months before that afternoon at the gate, cancer finally caught up with him. The farmhouse felt impossibly quiet after the funeral. The old kitchen clock seemed louder than ever, and even the porch swing sounded different without his boots scraping across the wooden boards. Before he passed away, he looked me straight in the eye and asked for one promise. Do not let anyone separate this family from this land. I promised him I never would. Life, however, has a way of pulling you farther away than you ever planned. My engineering job required months of travel across several states overseeing infrastructure projects, and although I visited whenever I could, I believed the farm would always be waiting exactly as I left it. Property taxes were paid automatically. Utilities remained active. The neighboring ranchers occasionally checked the fences after heavy storms. Everything seemed secure, or at least that was what I believed. Looking through the windshield at the polished entrance sign, the decorative stone walls, and the freshly planted rows of imported oak trees, I realized someone had spent months transforming my father's farm into something designed to impress strangers instead of honoring the family who built it. The breeze carried the faint smell of fresh mulch instead of cattle feed, and somewhere beyond that locked gate, I heard children laughing near houses that had never belonged there. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a misunderstanding. Someone had been rewriting my family's story while I was gone, one quiet decision at a time. The older guard disappeared into the security booth, but before the glass door closed, I caught a glimpse of framed certificates covering the wall behind him. Community Excellence Award, Neighborhood Safety Partner, Property Management of the Year. Everything looked polished, organized, respectable. That was the first thing I learned about Oak Ridge Farm Estates. Nothing about it looked stolen. A white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled toward the entrance with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. It stopped beside the guard station, and the driver's window lowered just enough for a woman wearing oversized sunglasses to exchange a few quiet words with the guards. Even from 30 feet away, I could smell expensive perfume drifting across the warm breeze. She stepped out with practiced confidence. Perfectly pressed linen clothes, spotless boots that had clearly never touched a muddy pasture, and a smile so carefully rehearsed it never quite reached her eyes. You must be Ethan Walker, she said before I introduced myself. I am Patricia Caldwell, president of the Oak Ridge Farm Estates Homeowners Association. She extended her hand as though we were about to negotiate a business partnership instead of standing at the entrance to my family's farm. I looked at her hand for a second before answering. This is my family's property. Her smile remained perfectly still. I understand why this situation feels emotional. Emotional? She used the word like it explained everything, as if 70 years of family history could be reduced to a passing feeling. She motioned toward the neighborhood behind her with a graceful sweep of her arm. Newly paved streets curved through what used to be grazing fields. Decorative street lamps stood where my father once repaired fences after spring storms. Fresh sod covered the old wagon trail leading toward the pond. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully planned. We have created something extraordinary for this community, Patricia continued. Families are thriving here. Property values have increased dramatically. The county fully recognizes our development. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had delivered the same speech dozens of times. Every sentence sounded polished enough to belong inside a real estate brochure. I kept staring beyond her shoulder toward the old red barn. Its roof was still visible above the new homes, almost hidden now between rows of young maple trees. Who authorized any of this? I asked quietly. Patricia folded her hands in front of her. All development was completed through the proper legal process. Ownership questions have already been resolved. There it was. Not anger. Not arrogance. Confidence. The kind that comes from believing every piece of paperwork has already buried the truth. A young couple drove past in a golf cart carrying groceries, smiling as they waved to Patricia. They looked happy. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks built over land where my grandfather once planted winter wheat. Nobody seemed to realize they were living inside someone else's family story. Patricia noticed where I was looking. People have built wonderful lives here, she said softly. Sometimes progress requires accepting that the past cannot stay exactly the way we remember it. The words settled over the entrance like dust. Progress. Community. Improvement. Every pleasant-sounding word covered another missing piece of my father's farm. I reached into my truck again and rested my hand on the old brass key inside the glove compartment. The edges had been worn smooth after decades of opening the same farmhouse door every evening. Patricia followed my movement, but said nothing. She believed she was looking at a defeated man holding on to an old memory. What she could not possibly know was that my father never kept important things in obvious places, and every lesson he ever taught me began with the same quiet reminder. Never assume the first story you hear is the true one. Patricia stepped aside as though our conversation had already reached its conclusion, but I did not start my truck. Instead, I watched another resident pull through the gate after a guard scanned a windshield sticker that read resident access. The steel barrier lifted without hesitation, then settled back into place with a mechanical hum that echoed across the entrance. That sound lingered longer than it should have. For nearly 70 years, nobody had ever needed permission to drive onto Walker land. Now a machine was deciding who belonged there. I finally looked back at Patricia. I would like copies of every document that supposedly transferred my family's property. She smiled with the patience of someone explaining a simple rule to a child. Our legal department can assist you with any records that are publicly available. Publicly available. Another carefully chosen phrase. And until then? I asked. She nodded toward the guards without changing her expression. Until then, I respectfully ask that you leave. We have homeowners who expect a peaceful environment. Homeowners. She said it naturally, as though my father's fields had always been planned for cul-de-sacs and decorative mailboxes instead of cattle and hay bales. I eased the truck into reverse, gravel crunching beneath the tires. But instead of heading back toward the highway, I parked on the county shoulder about 200 yards away beneath an old live oak tree. The same tree my father used to stop beneath every July because its shade was always 10 degrees cooler than the open pasture. From there I could see the entrance without being in anyone's way. Over the next hour, I watched moving trucks, landscaping crews, dog walkers, and delivery vans come and go through the gate. Nobody questioned where they were. Nobody wondered who had owned that land before them. Their lives continued normally because someone else had already convinced them that everything behind those fences belonged exactly where it was. As the sun drifted lower, I unfolded an old county road map from my glove compartment. My father never traveled without paper maps even after everyone else switched to navigation apps. He always claimed paper never lost signal. Across the faded lines he had scribbled notes in blue ink over the years. Fence repairs, water lines, soil conditions. Near the southern edge he had circled one small intersection and written only 3 words beside it. Never ignore access. I stared at those words longer than I expected. At the time he wrote them, I assumed he was reminding himself about farm equipment routes during harvest season. Now they carried a different weight. Just then my phone buzzed. The screen showed the name of our longtime neighbor, Hank Morrison, whose ranch bordered ours to the west. I answered immediately. His voice sounded lower than usual. "Ethan, I heard you came back today." "Word travels fast," I replied. He let out a quiet sigh. "Around here it does." There was a pause before he continued. "There are some things you need to know, but not over the phone." I looked back toward the entrance where Patricia was climbing into her white sport utility vehicle. She waved at another resident before driving through the gate without even slowing down. She looked completely relaxed, like someone who had already closed the final chapter of my family's story. I folded the old map carefully, slid it back into the glove compartment beside my father's brass key, and started the engine again. For the first time all day, I stopped thinking about what had been taken from me. Instead, I started wondering why my father had underlined those 3 words so heavily that the ink had nearly torn through the paper. Hank asked me to meet him at the old feed store on the edge of town just before sunset, the same place where ranchers had traded stories over black coffee for decades. The smell of fresh lumber, fertilizer, and roasted peanuts still hung in the warm evening air, almost unchanged from when my father used to bring me there every Saturday morning. Hank was already sitting on the wooden bench outside, his weathered straw hat resting beside him and a paper coffee cup warming his hands. He looked older than I remembered. The last 8 months had added more gray to his beard than the previous 10 years combined. When I walked over, he stood, shook my hand firmly, and looked at me with the kind of expression people wear when they wish they had better news. "Your dad knew something was coming," he said quietly. I frowned. What do you mean? Hank glanced around before lowering his voice even further. About a year before he got sick, developers started showing up around here. They offered to buy every ranch within 5 miles. Most folks said no. Some took the money. Your father never even entertained the conversation. I could almost hear my father's answer without Hank saying another word. Robert Walker believed land was borrowed from the next generation, not sold to the highest bidder. Hank continued. After that, survey crews started appearing along county roads. Then attorneys. Then planning meetings that nobody seemed to know about until they were already finished. A pickup rolled slowly past us, kicking a light cloud of dust across the parking lot. Hank waited until it disappeared before speaking again. When your father got weaker, Patricia Caldwell began attending county development hearings almost every month. She always talked about economic growth, housing demand, and preserving community values. He let out a dry laugh. Funny how people use the word preserving while changing everything around them. I wrapped both hands around my coffee, feeling the warmth against my palms as the evening breeze cooled. If everybody saw this happening, why did nobody call me? Hank looked genuinely uncomfortable. Most of us figured you already knew. Then rumors started spreading that your family had reached some kind of agreement. Folks stopped asking questions because everything looked official. Official. That word again. It seemed to follow Patricia everywhere. Hank reached into the cab of his truck and pulled out a worn manila envelope. Your dad left this with me about 6 months before he passed. He handed it over carefully. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were just 5 simple words. For Ethan, if needed. My throat tightened before I even opened it. Inside were several handwritten notes, copies of old property sketches, and a single folded page with one sentence underlined twice. Never argue with appearances. Verify everything. That sounded exactly like him. My father never trusted assumptions, even when they looked convincing. Hank watched as I folded the papers back into the envelope. He told me if anything ever felt wrong, you would know where to start. I looked at him. I do not know where to start. He smiled for the first time all afternoon. That is because you are looking at the houses. Your father always looked at the land underneath them. His words settled into my mind as naturally as the evening wind moving through the oak trees across the road. For the first time since reaching the gate, I stopped thinking about the neighborhood that had appeared on our farm. Instead, I started thinking about everything nobody wanted me to notice beneath it. I drove straight to the county records office the next morning before the courthouse clock struck 9. The building smelled exactly the way I remembered from years ago: old paper, floor polish, and stale coffee that had probably been sitting on the warmer since sunrise. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, spilling across rows of filing cabinets that seemed older than I was. My father always said that the truth usually lived in boring places because very few people had the patience to look for it. I signed the visitor log, requested every recorded document connected to the Walker property, and settled into a wooden chair with a stack of maps, surveys, and deed books spread across the table. At first, everything seemed to support Patricia's confidence. Recent filings referenced the development. Utility permits had been approved. Road improvement plans had official county stamps. Even the subdivision plats looked complete. It was easy to understand why everyone believed the story they had been told. Every page looked legitimate by itself. Then I remembered my father's note. Never argue with appearances. Verify everything. So instead of reading forward, I started reading backward. I compared modern surveys with ones recorded decades earlier. I matched legal descriptions line by line instead of relying on the colorful maps developers preferred to display. Hours slipped by until my eyes began to blur from staring at tiny measurements and handwritten notes. Then one sentence stopped me cold. It appeared in a survey recorded in 1982, tucked between routine boundary descriptions that most people would probably skip. Permanent access easement retained exclusively by Walker Agricultural Holdings. My heartbeat quickened. I requested the original filing instead of the digital copy. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned carrying a large rolled survey protected inside an aging cardboard tube. The paper crackled gently as I spread it across the table. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but every signature remained perfectly clear. My grandfather's name sat beside the county seal. An engineer's certification occupied the lower corner. Most important of all, A thick red line traced the only paved entrance connecting the public highway to what was now Oak Ridge Farm Estates. That road was never transferred. It had never been sold. It had never been abandoned. My grandfather had intentionally retained permanent ownership while granting limited agricultural access under very specific conditions. I leaned closer, reading every word twice to make sure excitement was not replacing accuracy. The easement could not be reassigned without written consent from Walker Agricultural Holdings or its lawful successor. My father had become that successor. After his passing, according to the probate documents I already possessed, that ownership transferred directly to me. I sat back slowly, hearing nothing except the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Outside the courthouse window, traffic continued as usual, completely unaware that one forgotten paragraph buried inside a 44-year-old survey had just changed everything I thought I knew. Patricia had spoken with absolute certainty because she believed the neighborhood controlled the entrance. The residents believed it too. Even the guards at the gate believed it. But belief and ownership had never been the same thing. I carefully rolled the survey back into its tube, feeling the same calm settle over me that I used to feel whenever my father solved a problem without raising his voice. For the first time since returning home, I was no longer searching for hope. I was holding evidence. I did not drive back to the entrance that afternoon. That was exactly what Patricia expected me to do. She expected arguments, raised voices, and emotional demands that could be dismissed with another stack of polished paperwork. My father handled problems differently. He used to tell me that if you already have the truth, there is no reason to rush. I spent the next several days building a picture that was much larger than a single survey. Every morning began before sunrise with the smell of strong coffee filling the small rental cabin where I was staying outside town. By 7 o'clock, I was meeting with a licensed surveyor who specialized in historic boundary research. Unlike everyone else I had spoken to, he did not begin by looking at the newest subdivision maps. He wanted the oldest documents first. We walked through faded aerial photographs, handwritten field notes, and engineering records dating back decades. Every line pointed to the same conclusion. The access road had always remained part of Walker Agricultural Holdings. Next came a title attorney recommended by Hank. Instead of promising quick victories, she spent nearly 3 hours reading every page I placed on her conference table. The only sounds in the room were the turning of paper and the soft tapping of her pencil against a yellow legal pad. Finally, she looked up and smiled. Someone relied on people assuming these documents no longer mattered, she said. They matter very much. Those 5 words were worth more than any dramatic speech. I hired a professional mapping company to compare the original legal descriptions with the current subdivision layout. Their drone imagery layered modern construction over historical property boundaries with remarkable precision. Streets, decorative entrances, sidewalks, and utility corridors all appeared exactly where they should have. The surprise was underneath them. Every route leading residents into the neighborhood crossed the same retained access easement my grandfather had protected more than 40 years earlier. I asked the surveyor one question. Is there another legal entrance? He adjusted his glasses, studied the map one more time, and slowly shook his head. Not according to these recorded documents. I thanked him, paid the invoice, and drove away without celebrating. Discovering evidence was only the beginning. Using it correctly required patience. Meanwhile, life inside the neighborhood continued as though nothing had changed. Construction crews finished landscaping near the entrance. New families unloaded moving trucks. Realtors proudly placed sold signs in front of freshly painted homes. Patricia appeared in a newspaper photograph, smiling beside local officials during a ribbon-cutting ceremony celebrating responsible community growth. Looking at that picture, nobody would have imagined that one overlooked legal document threatened the foundation beneath every congratulatory handshake. My phone rang twice during the week. The first call came from Patricia's office, politely reminding me that I remained prohibited from entering the property. The second came from a representative offering to discuss a peaceful resolution if I agreed to recognize the association's authority. I declined both conversations without mentioning a single word about the easement. Silence became my greatest advantage. Every additional day allowed more certified records, expert reports, and professional opinions to arrive in neatly organized folders across my dining table. By the end of the week, the old brass key my father carried no longer felt like a symbol of the past. Resting beside the surveys, title reports, and historical maps, it became a quiet reminder that some doors are never opened by force. They are opened by proving you held the right key all along. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning by certified mail, delivered in a plain envelope that looked almost ordinary compared to everything it contained. My attorney had filed the necessary notices with the county, the title company had certified every historical record, and the surveyor had completed his final report. We were not accusing anyone of anything dramatic. We were simply asking the court to determine who legally controlled the recorded access easement that served as the only permanent entrance into Oak Ridge Farm Estates. Facts have a quiet way of making noise when they are finally placed in the right room. 2 weeks later, we gathered inside a county courtroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and old law books. Patricia Caldwell sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys and several members of the association board. She looked exactly as confident as she had at the gate, greeting people with calm smiles and neat folders arranged perfectly across the table. I noticed she barely glanced in my direction. She still believed this would be another routine property dispute that ended with another confirmation of her authority. When the hearing began, the judge listened patiently as both sides summarized their positions. Patricia's attorney presented recent subdivision approvals, development permits, and association records. Everything appeared complete. Everything appeared organized. Then my attorney quietly stood and asked permission to introduce the original recorded survey from 1982 together with the certified chain of title, probate records, historical engineering documents, and the independent boundary analysis prepared by licensed experts. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as each exhibit appeared on the large display screen. One survey became another. One deed connected to the next. Decades of recorded history unfolded page by page until the thick red line, marking the retained access easement, filled the screen. The surveyor explained every measurement in careful detail, never raising his voice, never exaggerating a single conclusion. Finally, the judge leaned forward and asked one simple question. Is there any recorded document transferring ownership of this easement from Walker Agricultural Holdings? Patricia's legal team searched through several binders before quietly answering that they had found none. My attorney then presented the probate order establishing me as the lawful successor to that ownership. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. The judge reviewed the documents for several long minutes, while the only sound inside the courtroom was the gentle turning of paper. When he finally spoke, every word landed with remarkable clarity. The retained easement remained valid, had never been extinguished, and continued to belong to Walker Agricultural Holdings through its lawful successor. Any assumption to the contrary was unsupported by the recorded chain of title. Patricia's expression changed for the first time since I had met her. The confidence disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable realization that every confident statement she had made at the entrance depended on one legal conclusion that simply was not true. The court ordered further proceedings to address access rights and directed the parties to work within the recorded property interests established by the historical documents. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered near the front steps after hearing that the case involved one of the county's fastest-growing developments. I declined every interview. I had not spent weeks collecting evidence to win an argument in front of cameras. I had done it to honor a promise I made to my father. As I walked toward my truck carrying the same old brass key in my pocket, I realized that nothing had changed physically. The houses still stood. The gate still stood. The neighborhood still looked exactly as it had the day I first arrived. But underneath every sidewalk, every street, and every polished entrance sign, the truth had finally found its way back into the light. 3 weeks after the hearing, I drove back to the entrance just as the first light of sunrise stretched across the fields. The same gravel crunched beneath my tires, but this time the sound carried a different feeling. The black iron gate was still there, standing exactly where it had the first day I returned, except the temporary notices ordered during the legal process had replaced the old claims of exclusive control. One of the security guards recognized my truck before I even reached the booth. He stepped outside, gave a polite nod, and without saying a single word pressed the button that lifted the barrier. The motor hummed softly as the gate rose into the cool morning air. I eased the truck forward at the same slow speed my father always drove when entering the farm. The scent of fresh grass drifted through the open window, mixing with damp earth left behind by an overnight rain. Beyond the new homes, I could still see the old red barn standing proudly against the morning sky. Time had surrounded it, but it had never truly disappeared. I parked beside the barn and stepped out. The weathered wood felt rough beneath my fingertips exactly as I remembered. Every scrape and every nail carried another memory. I could almost hear my father laughing somewhere behind me while reminding me not to leave the gates open because the cattle would always find the smallest mistake. The cattle were gone now, replaced by walking trails and decorative fences, but his voice remained as clear as ever. Over the following months, attorneys, engineers, county officials, and the association worked through updated agreements that finally reflected the recorded property rights. Residents kept their homes. The neighborhood remained standing. New access arrangements respected the historical easement while ensuring everyone understood exactly who owned what. It was not the dramatic ending people expected, but my father never measured success by how loudly someone celebrated. He measured it by whether the truth still stood when everything else settled. Patricia Caldwell resigned from the association before the end of the year. I never celebrated that either. Carrying resentment would have accomplished nothing my father would have admired. What mattered was that assumptions had finally been replaced with verified facts. A few months later, I planted 3 young pecan trees beside the old barn where my grandfather once stored hay wagons. Hank came over with a shovel. We worked quietly, stopping only to wipe the dirt from our gloves and drink cold water beneath the shade of the same live oak that had watched over generations of our family. Before leaving, Hank smiled and looked across the property. "Your father would be proud," he said. I looked at the brass key resting in my palm, the one that had never opened the new gate, but had reminded me every day that ownership is not defined by appearances. It is protected by truth, patience, and the people willing to preserve both. I slipped the key back into my pocket and listened as the morning breeze moved through the pecan leaves with the same gentle sound I remembered from childhood. Some people believe history disappears the moment a new sign goes up or a fresh layer of pavement covers old ground. They are wrong. History waits beneath the surface, quiet and patient, until someone cares enough to uncover it. My father left me more than a farm. He left me the discipline to verify before believing, to stay calm when others rush to conclusions, and to understand that real justice does not need to shout. It simply arrives, one recorded page at a time.